Jacob Mullen's mornings had always followed a rhythm as steady as the ticking of an old clock. Before the sun rose over the gentle hills of Willow Springs, he was already out in his fields, the crisp air carrying the scent of damp soil and hay. His barn, a weathered but sturdy red building, stood like a loyal friend on the edge of his property. It wasn't just a barn to Jacob. It was where his father had taught him how to mend tools, where his mother had stored jars of summer preserves, and where he'd sheltered countless animals through storms. For over 3 decades, Jacob had kept to himself, working the land without much concern for what happened beyond his fences. The quiet suited him, and he had no reason to change. That peace began to shift a few years ago when the Willow Springs Lakeside Resort was built nearby. A sweeping man-made lake became the centerpiece, surrounded by upscale homes and manicured walking paths. Along with the resort came a homeowners association, an organized group that seemed to have a rule for everything. Jacob didn't think much about them at first. His farm sat a little apart from the resort homes, separated by the slow, winding channel that carried water into the lake. Still, he occasionally saw their members at the general store or driving past in polished cars. They nodded politely, but Jacob noticed the way their eyes lingered on his barn, the fences, and even his tractors, as if weighing them against some invisible standard. One warm summer morning, Jacob rose before dawn, as usual, and went out to check his fences. The air was heavy with the promise of a hot day. He was halfway across the pasture when he stopped in his tracks. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Where his barn had stood only yesterday was now a pile of splintered boards, broken beams, and shattered roofing. Tools lay scattered in the dirt. The old weather vane that had spun on the roof since he was a boy now rested, twisted, and bent in the grass. Jacob stood frozen for a long moment, his hat in his hand. He stepped forward slowly, the crunch of wood beneath his boots sounding far too loud in the quiet morning. Every corner of the barn had been knocked down. This wasn't the work of time or weather. It had been taken apart quickly, almost surgically, by... Mid-morning, a group of neatly dressed individuals arrived in matching blazers, their clipboards tucked under their arms. One of them, a tall man with silver hair, introduced himself as the association president. He explained in smooth and measured words that the barn had been removed because it interfered with the scenic view from the lakeside. The association, he added, had acted in accordance with agreed-upon visual guidelines. Jacob listened without interrupting. When the man was done, Jacob asked a single question. "What agreement?" The man smiled faintly, flipping through his papers. "The one you signed when the resort expanded. It includes guidelines for all visible properties near the lake." Jacob frowned. He had never signed such a thing. But the paper they showed bore his name in neat printed letters. He recognized neither the signature nor the date. The conversation ended with polite words, but the message was clear. They had no intention of rebuilding his barn. As the group walked back to their cars, Jacob remained by the wreckage. The barn's shadow was gone from the ground, leaving an empty space that felt larger than it was. That evening, as the sun set in a streak of gold across the hills, Jacob sat on his porch, staring toward the lake. He didn't speak of anger, nor did he make threats. But a quiet thought began to take shape, one rooted in patience, history, and the land itself. If they thought a barn was just a structure to be removed, they didn't yet understand how deeply this land and its water belonged to him. The morning after his barn was gone, Jacob drove into town. The air was already warming, the sky a pale blue above the distant hills. He parked his truck near the Willow Springs Lakeside Resort's meeting hall, a large, glass-fronted building that looked as though it belonged in a city rather than there. Quiet Valley. Inside, the cool air smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee. A receptionist in a crisp blazer greeted him with a bright smile, then directed him to a conference room where members of the association board were gathered. The table was long and polished, with neatly stacked documents at each seat. The association president, the same man Jacob had met the day before, rose to greet him. "Mr. Mullen, thank you for coming in. We hope to clear up any misunderstanding about the barn." Jacob nodded once, taking a seat at the far end of the table. "I'm here to understand why it was taken down without a word to me." The president slid a folder across the table. Inside were pages of rules, guidelines, and diagrams showing visual impact zones around the lake. The barn had been highlighted in red on one of the maps, marked as a non-conforming structure. This was all covered in the property aesthetics agreement, the president said. His tone was calm, almost friendly, as though he were explaining a routine matter. "I never signed that," Jacob replied, his voice even. A woman on the board, seated to the president's left, adjusted her glasses and leaned forward. "We have your name right here, Mr. Mullen. This is the signature page." She tapped a line at the bottom of one document. Jacob studied it. The signature was neat, smooth, nothing like his own rough handwriting. The date was from 2 years ago, during planting season when Jacob had barely left his fields. He looked up slowly. "That's not mine." The board members exchanged small, knowing glances. The president folded his hands on the table. "We understand change can be difficult, but the barn was not in harmony with the visual goals of our lakeside area. It was decided that its removal was in the best interest of the greater community." Jacob sat back in his chair. "And who decided that?" "The association board," the president said, "elected by the homeowners and guided by our shared vision." His smile never wavered. The conversation shifted. Instead of discussing the barn, the board began talking about possible improvements to Jacob's property. Fences, landscaping, even exterior paint colors. They spoke as though these changes were inevitable, as though his land had already been absorbed into their carefully maintained image. When Jacob asked about rebuilding his barn, the response was a gentle but firm refusal. "We'd encourage you to consider an alternative storage solution that's less visible from the lake," the woman with glasses said. "Something that fits the association's design guidelines." Jacob realized the meeting was not about solving the problem. It was about letting him know politely and firmly that he was expected to fall in line with their vision, and if he didn't, there would be consequences. As the discussion wound down, the president leaned slightly forward. "We also need to review your lake access rights," he said. "It's standard procedure whenever there's a major change to a property near the water." Jacob didn't respond immediately. He thought of the narrow channel that cut across his land, feeding the resort's lake. He had never given much thought to it. It had always been there, part of the natural flow. Now, for the first time, he wondered just how important it was to them. He stood, gathering the papers from the folder. "I appreciate your time," he said, his voice steady. "I'll be in touch once I've had a chance to look through these." The board members smiled and nodded as he left, likely believing they had made their position clear. Outside, Jacob stepped into the warm sunlight and looked across the manicured lawns toward the sparkling blue of the lake. It seemed calm, peaceful, untouched. But as he walked back to his truck, an idea began to form. Not in anger, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knew the land far better than any board ever could. Jacob had always believed that the answers to most problems could be found in two places: the soil beneath your boots and the records kept at the county office. The soil told you what would grow. The records told you who truly owned what. 2 days after the meeting with the association board, he parked his truck in front of the Willow County Administration Building. It was an old brick structure with tall windows, the kind of place where time moved a little slower and every drawer smelled faintly of paper and dust. Inside, The county clerk recognized him immediately. "Morning, Jacob," she said, peering over the counter. "What brings you in?" "Need to look at some property records," he replied. "Particularly anything on water channels, easements, and land surveys around Willow Springs." She led him into the records room, a space lined with filing cabinets and shelves heavy with bound books. A single ceiling fan turned lazily overhead, stirring the warm air. Jacob began his search, moving from drawer to drawer, pulling maps and survey charts onto the long wooden table. Hours passed quietly. Outside, the sunlight shifted across the windows, dust motes drifting in the beams. Jacob traced blue lines on faded maps, streams, creeks, and man-made channels, comparing them to newer diagrams. It was in an old folder marked Water Projects, 1991, that he found what he didn't even know he'd been looking for. A map showed the man-made lake at the resort, drawn before it was even built. Blue lines marked the water inflows with notes in neat handwriting. The largest channel, labeled Primary Supply, originated on his land. It ran through the low pasture, under a small footbridge, and into the lake's north side. Jacob leaned closer. 2 red circles were marked along the channel, one for the inflow valve and one for a smaller outflow near the far end. Both, according to the survey, sat entirely within his property boundaries. He kept reading, flipping through the attached documents. There was no record of the association purchasing rights to those channels. Instead, there was a short-term easement from the county to the original developers, set to expire after 10 years unless renewed. Jacob checked the date. It had expired more than a decade ago. He sat back in his chair, letting the weight of the discovery settle. The association's entire lake, their prize, their attraction, depended on water that crossed his land, and on paper, they had no valid claim to it anymore. Jacob quietly gathered copies of the maps and documents, thanking the clerk before stepping out into the afternoon light. Back at the farm, he walked down to the pasture where the channel flowed. The water moved steadily, a soft trickle over smooth stones. It was clear and cold, reflecting the late summer sky. Standing there, Jacob could hear the faint hum of distant activity from the resort. He imagined the sound of boats on the lake, the laughter of guests, and the board members talking about visual harmony. All of it existed because of this narrow ribbon of water. Over the next few evenings, Jacob began making preparations. He ordered equipment, pumps, hoses, and fittings from a supplier in the next town. The deliveries came quietly, unloaded, into the far side of his tool shed. He also took measurements along the channel, marking spots with small wooden stakes. To anyone passing by, it looked like ordinary farm work. Jacob didn't rush. He moved at the pace the land allowed, the way he always had. He fixed a section of fence by the pasture, mended a gate hinge, and sharpened tools in the shed. But in the back of his mind, a plan was forming with precise clarity. The association had taken something from him without warning, believing he had no way to respond. But the truth was, they had been relying on something that was his all along. Standing by the channel one evening, as the sun dipped low and the air turned cool, Jacob dipped his hand into the water. The current was steady, strong. He smiled faintly, not in triumph, but in the quiet recognition of an advantage no one else seemed to see. At least, not yet. By the time September arrived, the late summer heat had begun to soften, and the evenings carried a cool edge. The fields around Jacob's farm were turning shades of gold and brown, ready for the coming harvest. To anyone watching, it looked like an ordinary season for him. Steady work, quiet days, and the predictable hum of a life tied to the land. But Jacob had begun to make changes, subtle enough that no one from the association would think twice. The first was the fence along the main water channel. It was a simple wooden barrier, 3 posts high, running along the section that bordered the pasture. When a passing neighbor asked about it, Jacob said it was for livestock safety. It was the truth in its own way, though the livestock he had in mind wasn't of the four-legged kind. The second change came in the form of a small shed near the channel's edge. Jacob built it himself over the course of a week, using weathered boards and a tin roof that blended with the landscape. Inside, he stored a set of heavy-duty pumps, long hoses, and metal fittings, all still in their packaging. To anyone who peeked inside, it would look like general farm supplies, ready for irrigation or emergency use. While he worked, Jacob paid attention to the lake's appearance. The water line had always been something he noticed in passing, but now he studied it with quiet focus. Each week it dipped slightly, a natural occurrence during dry spells. But he knew the association monitored it closely, ensuring it never dropped too far for the comfort of the resort's guests. One afternoon, as he repaired the hinge on the pasture gate, Jacob saw two of the association's members walking along the far bank of the channel. They wore bright polos and carried clipboards, pointing now and then toward the water. When they reached the fence he had put up, they stopped briefly, talking in low voices. Jacob gave them a friendly wave from across the pasture, and after a moment they waved back and continued on. At night, Jacob often sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, thinking through his plan. He was in no hurry. The land had taught him patience. It had also taught him that the most effective changes were often the ones people didn't notice until much later. He began running a few tests with the pumps, not enough to cause any visible difference, but enough to understand their capacity. He directed small amounts of water into one of his unused irrigation basins, watching how quickly it filled. The sound of the pump was low and steady, blending into the evening chorus of crickets. During the day, life went on as usual. Jacob made his rounds in the fields, delivered a few sacks of grain to a neighboring farm, and even stopped by the general store to chat with the owner. Word around town was that the resort had a packed schedule of events for the autumn season. Boat, tours, fishing competitions, and outdoor dinners by the lake. Jacob listened politely, though he couldn't help but think about how those plans might depend on a certain water level remaining just right. One mild afternoon, Jacob stood by the channel, leaning on the fence post, watching the current. He could see where it curved gently before disappearing toward the lake. He imagined the same scene a few weeks from now, the flow slowed or redirected, the ripples stilled. The thought wasn't one of spite, it was of balance. The association had taken from him without warning, and now the land was offering him a way to set things right on his own terms. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the pasture. Jacob walked back toward the house, his boots crunching on the dry grass. The changes were small for now, just fences, a shed, a few quiet tests. But every step was deliberate. He was moving at the pace he knew best, letting the groundwork settle before the real work began. The first cool mornings of October brought a change in the air. Mist clung to the low ground around Jacob's farm, curling over the pastures like soft white fabric. Harvest season was winding down, and Jacob had been spending his days repairing equipment and preparing the fields for winter. Life moved in a steady rhythm until the association made its next move. He noticed it on a Wednesday morning while checking the far side of his property. Fresh stakes had been driven into the soil, each topped with a bright orange flag that fluttered in the breeze. They followed a straight line from the edge of the resort property into Jacob's pasture, stopping just short of the water channel. By mid-afternoon, a small crew had arrived with a compact paving machine and stacks of materials. Jacob stood at a distance, watching them unload. When he asked what they were doing, a man in a reflective vest smiled and said, "Installing the new scenic walking path. It's part of the resort's expansion plan. Will be a nice feature for everyone to enjoy." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "On my pasture?" The man hesitated, then gestured toward the resort buildings. "We've been given approval by the association. Shouldn't take more than a couple of days." It was clear to Jacob they hadn't asked him, and from the look of things, they weren't planning to. The association had decided his land was theirs to shape as they pleased, but instead of stopping them, Jacob simply nodded. "All right, you all have a good day." The workers looked surprised but went back to unloading their equipment. Jacob turned and walked toward the house, his pace unhurried. He didn't plan to confront them. This wasn't the moment for words. It was the moment for action. That evening, after the crew had gone, Jacob went to the small shed near the channel. He pulled out the pumps and hoses he had prepared weeks earlier. The night was quiet, the air cool against his face. The only sounds were the low rush of water and the distant call of a night bird. He set the pumps along the main inflow, connecting them to the irrigation basin he had cleared earlier in the season. The hoses stretched out across the grass, their ends anchored deep in the basin's edge. When he switched the pumps on, a steady hum filled the air. Water surged through the hoses, flowing into the basin at a rate that made the surface shimmer under the moonlight. Jacob stayed with the equipment for over an hour, checking connections and adjusting valves. By the time he shut the pumps down, for the night, the basin already held a shallow, gleaming pool. He knew he could run them for longer in the days ahead, gradually increasing the diversion without drawing immediate attention. The next morning, he went about his chores as usual. The crew returned to work on the walking path, laying gravel and smoothing it with quiet efficiency. Jacob waved to them as he passed on his tractor, his expression calm. Over the next week, the pumps ran for longer stretches each night. The basin filled steadily, feeding into a network of small irrigation ditches that wound through Jacob's fields. His late-season crops, which had been holding on through the dry spell, began to perk up, their leaves turning a deep, healthy green. Meanwhile, the resort's lake began showing the first signs of change. The waterline slipped a little lower, exposing narrow strips of muddy shoreline. Guests didn't seem to notice yet, but Jacob knew it was only a matter of time. One evening, standing by the basin as the pumps worked, Jacob looked out toward the faint glow of the resort's lights in the distance. He thought about the walking path cutting across his pasture, the barn that was no longer standing, and the conversations filled with polite but firm refusals. The land had a way of balancing things, he thought, and now, with each gallon of water flowing into his fields instead of the lake, that balance was beginning to shift. By the second week of October, the change in the resort's lake could no longer be brushed off as a trick of the light or a passing dry spell. The waterline had dropped far enough that the wooden pilings beneath the docks were fully visible, their bases coated with a crust of dried algae. Small boats, once gently rocking on the surface, now tilted awkwardly in the shallows. Guests strolling along the waterfront began to notice. They stopped to take pictures, not of the lake's beauty, but of its muddy edges. The water had taken on a faint brownish tint near the shore, stirred up by the shifting bottom. The fishing pier, a favorite spot for families, now stretched out, over patches of exposed rock instead of rippling blue water. The association responded in their usual fashion, by scheduling a meeting. They sent notices to residents and slipped a copy into Jacob's mailbox, though they had no idea yet that the source of their troubles ran straight across his land. Jacob attended, sitting in the back of the resort's bright conference room, while the board discussed unforeseen changes to the lake's ecosystem. They blamed the season, low rainfall, and possible blockages upstream. No one mentioned water rights. No one looked in his direction. After the meeting, he walked out without saying a word. That night, the pumps ran longer than they ever had. The basin on his land was now full enough to feed not just his irrigation ditches, but also a deep trench. He had dug toward an unused pond on the far side of his property. The sound of water rushing into the pond was steady and satisfying, a reminder that he was no longer at the mercy of their decisions. Within a week, the lake's decline became impossible to ignore. A local paper ran a small story about lake-level concerns, accompanied by a photograph that showed children standing where the water had once been waist-deep. The resort tried to keep events going, but the fishing competition had to be canceled. Guests complained to the front desk, asking for partial refunds or shorter stays. From his porch, Jacob could hear the distant whine of machinery as the association tried to address the problem. He imagined them sending divers into the water to check for leaks, inspecting pumps, and scratching their heads over maps that didn't match reality. One afternoon, as Jacob was stacking bales in the shed, a man in a blazer pulled up in a clean white SUV. He introduced himself as the resort's operations manager and asked if Jacob had noticed any changes in the water channel running through his land. Jacob wiped his hands on his jeans and nodded toward the pasture. "Water looks the same to me as it has for years," he said. The man glanced toward the fence and the shed, his eyes lingering a moment too long, then thanked Jacob for his time and left without further questions. That night, Jacob stood at the channel's edge, watching the moonlight glint off the surface. He thought about the barn, how it had stood for decades, weathering storms and seasons, only to be taken down in the span of a single day. He thought about the walking path cutting across his pasture without so much as a request. The pumps hummed beside him, their low sound blending with the rustle of wind through the grass. Every drop flowing into his fields felt like the land answering, back in its own quiet language. By the end of the month, the resort's lake was down nearly 3 feet. What had once been a postcard-perfect view now looked strangely tired, as though the water itself had decided to pull back. Jacob knew the association was getting closer to realizing the truth, but he also knew they had no quick solution, because the solution lay in the hands of the man they had underestimated from the start. The first frost of the season had settled over Willow Springs, leaving a silver sheen across the grass in Jacob's pasture. The air was sharp and still when the sound of tires crunching over gravel reached his ears. Jacob looked up from repairing a fence post and saw 2 black SUVs coming slowly down his drive. They stopped in front of his porch and 4 people stepped out. He recognized the association president immediately, his blazer buttoned tight, his polished shoes out of place, in the damp field. Alongside him were the woman with glasses from the earlier meeting, another board member Jacob didn't know, and the resort's operations manager who had visited him once before. "Mr. Mullen," the president began as they walked toward him, "we need to talk." Jacob set down his hammer and wiped his hands on a rag. "Morning. What brings you out here?" The group exchanged glances before the operations manager spoke. "The lake's water level has dropped to a point that's affecting our events, our residents, and the resort's reputation. We've looked into every possible cause, and it seems the main inflow runs through your property." Jacob nodded slowly. "That's right. Been that way since before the lake existed." The woman with glasses stepped forward, her voice careful. "We've noticed changes in the flow. We'd like your cooperation in restoring it to its original capacity." Jacob walked to the fence line, leaning against the top rail. "I can see how that might be important to you," he said evenly. "But before we talk about what I can do, we should talk about what's been done to me." The president shifted uncomfortably. "If this is about the barn—" "It is about the barn," Jacob interrupted, his tone calm but steady. "It's also about the walking path you put through my pasture without asking. It's about decisions made without so much as a conversation with the person whose land supports your lake in the first place." Silence hung in the cool air for a moment. The operations manager adjusted his tie, his expression tense. "What are you asking for, Mr. Mullen?" Jacob reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folder. Inside were copies of the old surveys, maps, and easement documents he had gathered from the county office. He handed them to the woman with glasses. "Those channels are on my land," Jacob said. "The original easement expired more than 10 years ago." You've been drawing water without any valid agreement. I've let it happen without complaint until the day my barn was taken down without warning." The president scanned the papers, his jaw tightening. "So what is it you want?" Jacob didn't hesitate. "Compensation for the barn and for the disruption to my land, enough to rebuild it to my specifications, along with an agreement that no further changes will be made to my property without my consent. If we can agree to that, the water will flow again." The board members exchanged uneasy looks. The president's polished calm was wearing thin. "That's a significant demand," he said. Jacob straightened. "And your lake is disappearing. By the day. You've already lost events and the residents are starting to ask questions. I'm offering you a solution that's quicker than anything else you've got." For a long moment, the only sounds were the faint rustle of leaves and the distant call of a crow. Finally, the woman with glasses closed the folder and gave a small nod to the president. "We'll discuss your terms," she said. "But I think we understand each other." Jacob gave a single nod in return. "I believe we do." They turned and walked back to the SUVs, their voices low as they spoke among themselves. Jacob watched them go, the frost crunching under their careful steps. He didn't smile, but there was a quiet steadiness in his gaze. The conversation had shifted. Now they understood that the water, and the power it represented, wasn't theirs to take for granted. The meeting at Jacob's farm had left the association with no doubt about where they stood. Within a week, they requested a follow-up, this time held in a small conference room at the resort. Jacob arrived on a cold, clear morning, wearing his old work jacket and carrying nothing but a small notepad. The president was there, along with the woman with glasses and the resort's operations manager. A few other board members sat quietly along the wall. The atmosphere was different now, more measured, less certain. "Mr. Mullen," the president began, "we've reviewed your terms. We are prepared to offer full compensation for the barn, as well as a written agreement ensuring that no alterations will be made to your property without your consent." Jacob listened without speaking, letting the words settle in the air. The woman with glasses slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a formal contract and a check large enough to cover not only the cost of a new barn, but the upgrades Jacob had already planned in his mind. "I appreciate that," Jacob said. "Once we sign, the water will be restored to the lake, immediately." They moved through the paperwork in steady silence, pens scratching across the pages. When the last signature was in place, Jacob stood, shook hands with each of them, and left without another word. Back at the farm, he went straight to the small shed by the channel. The pumps were shut down and the diversion valves were closed. Within hours, the flow into the lake began to rise. The current carried leaves and twigs downstream, just as it always had, making its way toward the resort's docks. It would take days for the lake to return to its full level, but the change was visible almost immediately. The muddy shoreline slowly disappeared under rippling water, and the boats settled evenly in their slips. From his porch, Jacob could see the glint of the afternoon sun on the growing expanse of blue. The following weeks were filled with construction on his property. Jacob hired a local crew to help rebuild the barn, using strong timber and a reinforced frame that could stand for generations. The new design was larger than the old one, with wide double doors, a loft for storage, and a workbench that stretched the length of the north wall. When the walls were painted a bright, cheerful yellow, the barn stood out boldly against the rolling green of the pasture. It was visible from the resort's walking paths, a fact Jacob didn't mind at all. In the late afternoon light, it almost glowed, a reminder to anyone who looked that the land and its history belonged to the people who cared for it. Life settled back into its familiar rhythm. Jacob tended his fields, repaired his fences, and kept the channel clear. The lake remained full, its surface once again reflecting the hills and sky like a mirror. At the resort, events resumed, and the guests returned to their usual routines. But there was a subtle change in the way the association treated Jacob. They no longer sent crews onto his land without asking. When they needed access to the channel, for maintenance, they called ahead, speaking with a politeness that hadn't been there before. The walking path through his pasture remained, but now it curved neatly along the fence line, respecting his boundaries. On a crisp winter afternoon, Jacob stood in the doorway of the new barn, looking out over his land. The field stretched wide and quiet, the lake shimmering in the distance. The balance had been restored, not by loud arguments or drawn-out battles, but by understanding the quiet strength of owning the one thing the other side needed most. He picked up a worn hammer from the workbench and set to hanging a weather vane above the barn's loft door. The metal gleamed in the pale sunlight, turning gently with the wind. It wasn't the same one from his old barn. It was sturdier, brighter, and ready to stand watch for years to come. Jacob smiled faintly as he stepped back to look at it. The land, the water, and the barn were his again, and in that quiet moment, he knew they always would be.